Delano grape workers once proclaimed, "The grapes grow sweet and heavy on the vines, but they will have to wait while we reach out first for our freedom. The time is right for our liberation." This desire for freedom would be the driving force behind the long boycott of grapes originating in California's Coachella Valley. In the 1920s and 1930s, masses of Filipinos and Mexicans immigrated to America looking for better opportunities and jobs. Most of these immigrants became farm workers, however, most couldn't speak, read, or write English, making it difficult for them to negotiate with their bosses. Workers endured back-breaking labor under the sun, consistently risking the threat of killer chemicals and pesticides poisoning, while still earning no fringe benefits. The homes they rented from their bosses oftentimes had no electricity or running water, and workers were paid low wages of 70 cents to $1.20 per hour, which was much lower than other professions in the country. While laws were being passed at the time to protect other kinds of workers, farm workers weren't being considered. On September 8, 1965, the Delano grape strike began when Filipino farmers refused to pick the grapes in the Delano vineyards, aiming to obtain higher pay and improved working conditions after being ignored by their growers. Larry Leong and Ben Gines, Filipino activists, planned the strike with the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. After realizing that inviting the Mexican workers to the cause would make the success more achievable, Leong appealed the strike to Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, civil rights leaders of the National Farm Workers Association. Despite their hesitation to strike, what started as a walkout of less than 2,000 Filipino grape workers became a national boycott much larger than anyone could have ever imagined. Weeks of protest became months, and months turned into years. The movement gained national attention throughout the U.S. as it spread from the walkouts in the country to protests in the city, becoming one of the biggest labor struggles in American history. Although the Delano grape strike faced continual opposition, farm workers protested together and formed new unprecedented partnerships with other organizations in an effort to unionize farm labor, resulting in improved working conditions and protections for future generations of laboring Americans. Tough resistance from all fronts slowed initial progress in the movement. After Filipinos walked out on September 8th, table grape growers used intimidation and violence to silence the laborers and prevent the growth of the rising movement. They turned off gas and water in camps and beat their workers, trying to force them into silence. Growers evicted strikers who lived in company housing, forcing them to live under bridges and riverbanks, oftentimes threatening laborers with deportation. Despite this terrorism, Mexican farmers continued to strike, but as the strike grew, so did the workers' wrath. Violent arrests heightened tensions between the Delano community and farm workers. According to one striker, the police on the streets of California would drive back and forth past a farm worker's office all day, ready to shoot as they expected a revolution to break out at any second. This photo demonstrates the crippling tensions around the Delano area, capturing the funeral procession of 24-year-old Nagi Dafula, who died after a police officer struck his skull with a flashlight. As the Delano grape strike went on, opposition persisted. With false accusations, people tried to dismiss the movement by claiming it was propaganda for communism, with some even trying to have Chavez arrested for his organization of the strikes. Additionally, there were many attempts made to divide the Filipinos and Mexicans, trying to stop the two groups from gaining more power. Growers threatened that they'd draw from the large population of Mexican-American farm workers to replace the striking Filipino crews in certain fields. Many Americans began to view the Filipinos as far more radical than the Mexicans, so as national publicity initially followed the budding movement, the media favored the Mexicans and almost entirely focused on them, while the Filipinos' role was often forgotten. One Filipino-American even declared, "Caesar is revered, and the sad part is Larry Leong and the Manogues' role has been diminished to a footnote in history." Despite attempts to pit them against each other, Filipino and Mexican farm workers continued to protest together as national attention increased, joining with other groups for the first time in labor history to further expand the movement. During the summer of 1966, the Filipino and Mexican farm workers unions, the AWOC and NFWA, officially merged, forming the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, or the UFW. Mexicans and Filipinos attempted to bridge the divide between them, while support from outside the Coachella Valley emerged. The farm labor movement will become multi-ethnic and diverse in age and background. Grape workers continuously urged American consumers to boycott non-union grapes like Schenley Industries and the DiGiorgio Grape Growing Corporation. Using nonviolent methods, they made their plight a part of the national civil rights conversation, garnering support and sympathy from the public. At the same time, Americans were joining progressive political groups in large numbers, partly due to the attention brought by the civil rights movement. Millions of idealistic young people were eager to participate in protest marches and civil rights events seen on the news. The UFW invigorated these young activists. Organizers from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Congress of Racial Equality, along with student activists from the Bay Area, began planning their own protests. Groups like the NAACP helped distribute flyers urging Americans to not buy California grapes. Despite the Catholic Church initially remaining neutral due to cultural differences and language barriers, they eventually partnered with the farmworkers in support of the cause. During the strike, Chavez continuously emphasized his Catholicism in two of America's most Catholic magazines, contributing a significant amount to the coverage of the movement. Religious sites regularly published articles favorable to Chavez, often praising his strong Catholicism and use of nonviolent tactics that aligned with the Bible, which helped convince a wide audience of religious leaders that the strike was not just a local issue limited to California, but rather a national one of great importance for all Catholics who oppose human suffering. On March 17, 1966, workers and their families marched from Delano to Sacramento to showcase their support for the farm workers' struggle. As they marched, they were joined by a growing number of supporters, bringing widespread attention and exerting more pressure on growers and government officials to take action. In the spring of 1966, U.S. Senate member Robert Kennedy spent a day with Cesar Chavez during the march to Sacramento, learning of all the terrible injustices protesters faced. At the 1966 U.S. Senate Subcommittee hearing for migratory labor, Kennedy defended and endorsed farm workers' rights to form a union.
It's not just a question of wages, it's a question of housing, it's a question of education, it's a question of living conditions, it's a basic question of hope for the future.
Kennedy's and other politicians' high public profile aided in spreading awareness to the American public, boosting morale as the strike leaders successfully utilized media coverage to their advantage to emphasize that the farm labor struggle is part of a much broader movement for civil rights. In an attempt to halt the violence launched at boycotters, Chavez went on a hunger strike in 1968, during which Martin Luther King Jr. sent him a telegram shown to the media, which commended Chavez's efforts and perseverance. Reaching as far as New York, strikers decided to organize neighborhood coalitions divided into church, labor, liberal, and student groups, aimed at protesting large grape chains in the city. This widespread call to other groups perpetuated a new strategy regarding mass protests in the farm labor movement, an important turning point and part of the reason why the strike was so successful, leading the Delano grape strike to achieve its goals. The successes of these partnerships led to a large growth in the farm labor movement, generating better institutional working conditions, support, and protections for farm workers in America. By 1969, California grape growers estimated the losses to be about $25 million due to the nationwide boycott of non-union grapes. Companies were forced to sign contracts so that they wouldn't go bankrupt. By July 1970, 26 grape growers signed contracts with the U of W, which represented 35% of the grape growing industry, becoming the first largely successful union in agricultural history. Companies agreed that the growers would grant an immediate pay raise to $1.65 an hour and an eventual raise to $1.80 an hour. Employees would pay 10 cents an hour per worker into the union's health and welfare plan, which included medical care and financial assistance. The union established a day of rest provision for farm laborers, stipulating that each worker would be entitled to 1 day off in each work week. Additional improvements included a union-run hiring hall, a community center, and certain safety protections from pesticides. However, the UFW didn't stop looking out for workers after the contract signings of 1970. The UFW opened offices throughout California and Arizona, but boycott committees were founded in Oklahoma and other states. Inspired by the successful Delano grape strike, the UFW salad bowl strikes began in 1970 after most Salinas Valley growers signed sweetheart contracts with another labor union, the Teamsters, to keep the UFW out of the lettuce fields. The UFW once again called for a nationwide boycott and used techniques learned from the Delano strike to convince some large vegetable companies to abandon their Teamster agreements and sign fairer UFW contracts. Then in 1975, the UFW successfully guided a new law through the state of California. The California Agricultural Relations Act ensures California farm workers their ability to organize without interference from their labor organizations, promises union voting rights for seasonal workers, protects from discrimination in the hiring process, and provides laborers the ability to bargain collectively with their employers. To this day, the UFW continues to empower migrant workers around the U.S. Recently, it has helped pass the first law in the country supplying Californian farm workers with overtime pay after 8 hours each day. Despite the initial violence and resistance that growers and members of the community inflicted upon strikers, farm workers endured together as Mexicans and Filipinos joined forces with other movements and organizations. Together, these groups created the UFW, Revolution of the Farm Labor Movement in the U.S., and established protections that will follow farm workers in continuing to improve their lives. The Delano Grape Strike offers a timeless guide in collaboration, unity, and perseverance in the face of struggle, which broke through barriers to ensure a better future for the generations of American farm workers.